For a long moment after the bite, neither of them moved at all, and the only sound in the apartment was two people breathing like they had run somewhere. Reon's mouth was still at his throat. Soobin could feel the alpha's heart going hard against his own chest, could feel the exact moment the rut crested and broke and left the man shaking on top of him with something that was no longer hunger, and neither of them said anything because neither of them knew what there was to say. Before we go any further, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. I love reading everyone. Now, back to the story. When Reon finally lifted his head, his eyes were wide and dark, and not entirely his own yet. He looked at the mark on Soobin's neck, the fresh crescent his own teeth had just made, and what surfaced on his face was not at all what Soobin expected. Not regret, not denial, but something soft and stunned and open. The face of a man who had braced for a fall his whole adult life and just discovered the ground was closer than he feared. "I bit you," Reon said. His voice came out wrecked. "I'm so sorry. I have never in my life lost control like that. I went into rut with no warning and He stopped, his hand hovering over the mark, afraid to touch it. "Are you hurt? Tell me if I hurt you." "I'm not hurt," Soobin managed, and that was the whole problem. Because he was not hurt at all, he was the opposite of hurt. His body was singing in a way it never had in his careful gray life, and he was so far past shocked that he could not find a single true sentence to say. This was the moment. He knew it even then, lying half under an alpha who thought he was someone else, with a bond already humming between them like a struck wire. This was the moment to say it. "I'm not Taeryn. I'm his brother. We swapped." The whole thing was sitting right there at the back of his teeth, and he could not do it. He opened his mouth and the truth would not come. He was too stunned, too undone, too aware that the instant he said it, the singing would stop, and the man looking at him with that soft, open face would look at him a different way forever. So he said nothing. He let the moment pass. He felt it go, and he hated himself, and he let it go anyway. "We have to hide this," Reon said. It was so exactly the wrong-shaped lifeline that Soobin grabbed it with both hands. "Yes," he said. "We do. We have to." Not because Reon pressed the heel of his hand to his own sternum, to the place a bond settles, and Soobin watched him feel it land there for the first time, watched the man register that something had been welded into him. Not because I'm ashamed. I want to be clear about that. I am not ashamed of. He gestured between them, at the couch, the mark, the wreck of the night. But you and I work in the same building. There are rules about this is exactly the kind of thing that ends two careers in a quiet meeting with the door closed. If anyone at the firm finds out two people who work cases together bonded during a... He exhaled. "We hide it. Until we figure out what this is. We tell no one. Not anyone. Do you understand? This stays between us." "No one," Soobin agreed, and the relief that flooded him was so enormous and so cowardly that it made him sick, because Reon thought they were hiding a bond, and Soobin was hiding a bond and a name and a brother and an entire false week, and every yes he gave dug the hole 1 foot deeper. Reon sat back. He ran both hands down his face, and then, from behind the hands, muffled, came a sound Soobin did not expect at all. He was laughing, quietly, helplessly, the laugh of a man who has had the floor pulled out from under him and discovered he is somehow still standing. "Something changed this past week," Reon said, lowering his hands, and his eyes were bright now, almost wet. 3 years I sat next to you and you were just the guy at the next desk. Good in a meeting, easy to work with, nothing I ever thought about twice. And then this swap thing started, and you were suddenly... He stopped, searching. I do not know how to say it. You came out from behind something, and I could not stop looking. I have spent this whole week losing my train of thought over a man I thought I already knew, and tonight my body just decided for me. And the worst part, the part I should feel terrible about and somehow do not, is that I feel like I can finally breathe. He looked at the mark again, and this time he let himself touch it. One fingertip, feather-light, and Soobin shivered down to his feet. I should be panicking. I am, a little. But mostly I just feel like something I have been carrying all week, this pull I could not explain or stop, finally has somewhere to go. And there it was. The catharsis. The thing pouring off the alpha in waves the bond carried straight into Soobin's chest. Relief and tenderness and a stunned, dawning happiness. And Soobin received all of it, every drop, and could not give a single honest thing back, because the man was happy about a person who did not exist. He was happy about Taeryn. The Terran he thought had finally come out from behind 3 years of careful distance, the man he believed he had spent these last weeks falling for and had finally, recklessly, claimed. Except it had been Soobin in that chair all week. It had been Soobin he got coffee for, and Soobin he drove home, and Soobin whose company had set down whatever he had been carrying. The man was right about everything except the name, and the name was the one thing that would unmake all the rest of it. And Soobin lay there in the warm ruin of it, and said, in a voice that came out smaller than he meant, "You should get some rest. The rut's not all the way out of you yet." "Will you?" Reon started, and then caught himself, and Soobin watched him pull the careful man back on like a coat. "I should go. If I stay, I won't, and you need to sleep, and we both need to think." He stood, unsteady, and found his coat. At the door, he turned. He looked at Soobin for a long moment, soft and undone and bonded, and he said, "Thank you. I don't know exactly what for, but thank you." And then he was gone, and Soobin was alone with the mark and the bond and the unsaid thing, and the scent of the two of them together, the rain on warm stone hanging in the empty room like proof. He did not sleep. He lay on his brother's couch in his brother's apartment with his hand over a mark that belonged to a stranger, and he felt the bond reach across the city toward the man it had chosen, and he understood that he was in very serious trouble. The kind that does not have a clean exit, the kind where every direction out is also a direction deeper in, because the agony of it, the real agony, was not guilt alone. If it had only been guilt, he could have confessed and bled it out and started healing. It was that the guilt was tangled up with the opposite of guilt, with a pull so strong it frightened him, with a body that wanted the alpha back the moment the door closed, with a bond that turned the man's absence into a low physical ache located precisely under his ribs. He was bonded to someone he had deceived. He was attracted past all sense to someone he was actively lying to. And every hour he stayed silent, the man fell a little further for a name that was not his, and the reckoning, when it came, would only be worse for the wait. And under all of that, threaded through it like a second wire, was Terran, his brother, whose colleague this was, whose careful 3-year friendship Reon thought he was building on, whose life Soobin had been wearing when he let it happen. Soobin had deceived an alpha, yes, but he had also stolen something that belonged in some tangled way to his own twin, and he was going to have to look Taeryn in the face, the same face as his own, and find a way to say it. He could not even begin to imagine how. The week was finished. The bite had landed on its last night, which meant the experiment was technically over the moment Reon's teeth closed, the whole borrowed stretch simply gone, and by every prior plan the twins should have met the next day, traded their phones and keys back, and returned to their own lives. That was the plan. The plan did not survive contact with what both of them were quietly feeling. They met 2 days after that final night, at Taeryn's apartment, the one Soobin had been borrowing all week, ostensibly to trade everything back. Taeryn arrived bright and brisk and full of stories from a week of being a product designer, and he did not notice at first the one thing his brother was very carefully arranged to make sure he did not notice. Soobin was wearing a scarf, indoors, in a warm apartment. A soft gray scarf wound twice around his throat and tucked into his collar, and he had practiced in the mirror looking casual in it, which is a difficult thing to look. "Why are you dressed like you're about to narrate a documentary about the Moors?" Taeryn said, setting down the box of returned things. "I've got a sore throat," Soobin said. "Bad one. Came on yesterday. I think I'm fighting something off." "You sound fine." "It's the kind that's worse than it sounds. Scratchy, tender." He pulled the scarf a fraction higher. "The scarf helps. Warmth, for the throat." Taeryn looked at him for a second, the lawyer flicker passing behind his eyes, the part of him that noticed when a witness over-explained, and Soobin held his breath. But then his brother shrugged and turned to the box. There was no version of the truth that Taeryn's mind would reach for from a scarf. The truth was insane. No reasonable person looks at a brother in a scarf and thinks, "Ah yes, of course he has been secretly bonded by my colleague who believes he is me." Some lies are safe precisely because the truth behind them is too absurd to guess. And then, instead of trading the phones back, the strangest thing happened, which was that neither of them reached for the box. "So," Taeryn said, a little too casually, turning a coffee mug over in his hands. "I was thinking, the week's technically up. We're supposed to switch back tonight. But the Hale matter isn't going to settle for at least another week, and it would honestly be cleaner for the file if the same person stayed on it through the next round of red lines instead of me parachuting back in cold." He set the mug down. "So, hypothetically, we could just do another week, for continuity, on the case." Soobin looked at his brother for a long moment. "For continuity," Soobin repeated. "On the case. On the case. You hate that case. You called it the most boring indemnity dispute in the hemisphere. You said the only good thing about it was..." And Soobin stopped because he had been about to say, "The only good thing about it was the coworker who brings you coffee," and his brother's ears had gone faintly pink, and the whole thing arranged itself in the air between them at once. Taeryn did not want another week of the case. Taeryn wanted another week of the studio, of the quiet alpha by the window who brought him coffee from the real place and looked at him like he was worth looking at. And he was sitting here inventing a redline schedule to avoid saying so, which was very convenient as it happened, because Soobin had been about to invent something just as flimsy. He had been rehearsing it on the way over, some line about how it would be a shame to drop the design project he had handed off mid-stride, when the truth was that the design project had nothing to do with it, and the thing he could not bear to give back was a man across the river who thought his name was Taeryn and drove him home every night. "Funny," Soobin said slowly, "because I was actually about to ask you the same thing. For the design handoff. Continuity." "Right," Taeryn said. "Continuity. It would be a shame to drop it mid-stride. Terrible. Unprofessional, really." They looked at each other across the table. Two identical men, each holding a transparently fake excuse, each pretending not to see straight through the others, which was a thing they had never in their lives been able to do. "One more week," Taeryn said. "One more week," Soobin agreed, and did not say why, and neither did his brother, and they shook on it as they had the first time. Two identical hands across a kitchen table, except that this time both of them were lying about the reason, and both of them knew it. And neither of them was going to be the one to say it out loud, because saying it out loud would have made it real, and right now, real was the most frightening word either of them owned. So the box stayed packed, the phones stayed swapped, and Soobin went back not to his own gray life, but to the borrowed one, back to the firm across the river, back to being a man named Terran for another whole week, which should have terrified him and instead felt, in the cowardly bottom of his heart, like a reprieve. Because as long as the swap continued, he did not have to tell Reon the truth. As long as he was Terran, he got to keep being the person Reon was falling for without ever having to watch the falling stop. It was the worst possible reason to extend a lie. And he knew it, and he did it anyway, the same way he did everything, by choosing the warm thing now and leaving the cold reckoning for a later that he told himself would never quite arrive. And Reon, for his part, was not a man who did anything by halves. The text started the next morning. Not pushy, careful even, but constant. The steady attention of an alpha who had finally let himself want something and was now organizing his whole considerable competence around it. Did you sleep? Is the mark healing all right? Tell me honestly. I keep thinking about the thing you said about your work, the real work, the part you actually like. I want to hear more about that. Soobin read each one with a tight ache behind his ribs because the man was not texting Taeryn the lawyer at all. He was texting the person from that week, the warm one, the one who had let slip in an unguarded moment a true thing about himself. Reon had spent 3 years beside the careful, contained Terran, near enough to work with and never near enough to catch the personal note under the surface. Then 1 week beside the real Soobin, open and warm, the note right there to read. He had never known there were 2 people, and now he was reaching, in every single message, for the real one. For Soobin. By the wrong name. It would have been easier if Reon had been reaching for Taeryn. Soobin could have ached cleanly then, could have known the man was lost to him, could have grieved and moved on. But the man was not lost to him. The man wanted him, the actual him, and had no idea that was what he was doing, and there was no clean grief available in that, only the daily ache of being wanted under a borrowed name. And the trouble was that Soobin could not avoid the man, because the swap put him at the next desk over every single day. He could only manage him. He kept the scarf on. He answered the text late and short. He arrived early and left in the middle of a crowd and timed his coffee runs for when Reon was in deposition, building a whole quiet architecture of near misses inside a single shared floor, telling himself it was strategy. It was cowardice, and he knew it. And he did it anyway. And he could not, in the end, hold the line he had drawn. That was the part he had not planned for. He had built the whole architecture of avoidance, believing he was a person who could stay behind a wall once he chose to, and he was learning, one losing afternoon at a time, that he was not that person at all, that the wall was Taeryn's, that he had only ever been able to borrow it the way he had borrowed everything else, and that under pressure from a man who smelled like rain coming down on warm stone, it came apart in his hands, like wet paper. It happened in small surrenders. He would arrive early to beat Reon to the floor, and Reon would already be there, 2 coffees on the desk, and Soobin would mean to take his and mumble something and retreat. And instead he would sit, and they would talk, and an hour would be gone before he remembered he was supposed to be hiding. He would tell himself, walking in each morning, "Today I keep it short." He never kept it short. The man asked him questions, real ones, the kind nobody at the studio or the firm had asked him in years, and Soobin had spent his whole life being the one who asked the questions and filled the silences, and there was something undoing about sitting on the other side of that for once, about being the one a careful person leaned toward and wanted to hear. On the 3rd morning of the 2nd week, Reon brought him a pastry from the corner place, the good one, the one that sold out by 9, and set it down without a word and went back to his deposition. And Soobin looked at it, sitting there on a napkin, and felt his eyes sting for no reason he could have defended in court. It was such a small thing. It was a man remembering what he liked and getting there before 9 to make sure he had it. Nobody had done a small thing like that for Soobin in longer than he wanted to count. He ate it slowly. He did not retreat that morning either. He kept the scarf on through all of it, the one true precaution he refused to drop. And Reon noticed, because Reon noticed everything, and one afternoon he nodded at it and said, mild, not pushing, only curious that he had never known Soobin to feel the cold indoors, and Soobin said the building ran chilly on this side, and Reon let it go with the small, private look of a man filing away one more thing that did not fit, and choosing, for now, not to ask. The mark underneath the wool had settled into something Soobin could feel like a low, constant note, a place on his throat that warmed whenever the alpha came near, and he had taken to pressing his palm flat over the scarf when Reon crossed the floor, holding the note down the way you would hold a struck string to silence it, except that nothing silenced it. It only got louder the longer the second week ran. The drives home came back too, because Reon offered, the way he had the first week, and Soobin meant to say no and said yes every time. And the car did to him what the car had always done, made the world small and close and full of the scent of the man beside him. He told himself it was logistics. He told himself a great many things in that car, watching the wet streets slide by, and not one of them survived the moment Reon turned and asked him something quiet about his life. The real one. The party kept locked, and Soobin heard himself answering. True things. The actual shape of his loneliness. The gray of his days, dressed up just enough in Taeryn's circumstances to keep the cover from tearing. He was handing the man the locked-up part. He had been warned about exactly this. He did it anyway, a little more each evening, because the man received it like it mattered. And being received like that was a thing Soobin had stopped believing was available to him. What frightened him was not that he was failing to keep his distance. What frightened him was how good it felt to fail. Every surrender left him lighter, not heavier, which made no sense for a man digging his own grave one pleasant conversation at a time. He would lie on his brother's couch at night with his hand over the mark and feel the bond reach across the city, warm and certain and entirely unbothered by the catastrophe waiting at the end of it. And he would think, with a clarity that arrived only in the dark, that he was not falling for Reon despite the lie. He was falling for Reon, full stop, and the lie was simply the ground it was happening on, and the longer he let it happen, the more it was going to cost when the ground gave way. He should have known a careful man would notice a pattern. It was late on an afternoon near the middle of that second week when Soobin thought he had timed his exit perfectly and had not, that he came around a corner on the firm's quiet floor and walked directly into the one person he had been arranging his whole day around not being alone with. "You're avoiding me," Reon said. He said it quietly because the floor had ears, but there was a thread of something under the quiet that Soobin had not heard from him before, hurt sharpening into something with an edge. 5 days. 5 days of text you answer an hour late in 3 words. You sit one desk away from me and you find a reason to be somewhere else the second I look up. You leave for coffee the moment I stand. You time it. You think I don't notice you timing it. A muscle worked in his jaw. Talk to me. In here. Now. And before Soobin could find a single one of the careful evasions he lived by, Reon had taken him by the arm, not roughly, but with the absolute, unhurried certainty of an alpha who has decided something, and steered him through the nearest door, which happened to be the floor's small, empty restroom, and let it swing shut behind them, and the latch clicked, and they were alone. "Reon," Soobin started. "No, my turn." Reon turned, and Soobin took a step back, and his shoulders met the door. And then there was nowhere left to go, because the alpha had stepped in close and braced one forearm against the door beside Soobin's head, near but not touching. Close enough that the scent came off him in a wave, wet limestone and bitter orange and the warm spice underneath. Close enough that the bond surged so hard, Soobin's knees went unreliable. "I have been trying to give you room," Reon said, low, his face very near. "I told myself you were scared. I told myself it was a lot, the rut, the mark, all of it happening at once, and you needed space, and I was going to be patient because patient is the one thing I know how to be." His eyes searched Soobin's face. "But this isn't space. This is running. And I can feel it, you understand. That's the thing you keep forgetting. I can feel you on the other end of this. So don't stand there and tell me you don't want to be near me because the bond doesn't lie. And right now, this close, I know exactly how you're feeling about me. I can feel it coming off you, so look me in the eye and tell me I've got it wrong." Soobin couldn't tell him he had it wrong, because he did not have it wrong, because every part of Soobin had turned toward the Alpha like something rooted, turning toward light, because the Omega in him, the part with no interest at all in cowardice or guilt or borrowed names, recognized the man it was bonded to and wanted nothing on earth but to close the last few inches. He should have pushed Reon away right then. He meant to. What happened instead, with the door at his back and the Alpha's breath on his mouth and the bond singing between them, was that Reon closed the last of the space and kissed him, and Soobin kissed him back. There was nothing careful left in either of them, nothing held back. Reon made a low sound against his mouth, the sound of a man getting a thing he had stopped letting himself hope for, and his hand came up to the side of Soobin's throat, his thumb resting just below the mark he had made, and the contact ran through the bond and doubled back, so that Soobin felt the Alpha's feeling layered over his own, the rain on warm stone blooming in the small, bright room until it was all either of them could breathe. Reon kissed him like a man who had spent 2 weeks holding himself back and had just run out of reasons to, and Soobin met him for every second of it, like a man with no name and no brother and no lie, because for the length of the kiss he was only the body, only the bond, only the yes. And then his mind came back. It always came back. It came back with Taeryn's face in it, the same face as his own, and the scarf, and the truth he still had not said, and the knowledge that every second of this beautiful thing was being given to a man who thought he was kissing someone else. Soobin put his hands on Reon's chest and pushed. Not hard. He could not make himself push hard, but enough. Reon went still and pulled back, his breathing ragged, his eyes asking a question, and Soobin pressed back against the door with his hand still flat on the Alpha's chest, holding him at the one distance that was survivable, and said, in a voice that shook, "I can't." Reon. Not like this. There's something I have to. There's something you don't. And the truth rose up in him again and would not come. Would not. Because the restroom of a law firm with the latch barely holding was not where a thing like this could be said, and because saying it would end the warmth of the man's hand on his throat forever, and Soobin was not strong enough. Not today. Not yet. I just can't right now. Please. I need you to trust me that there's a reason. And I need you to give me a little more time. And I know I have no right to ask you for time when I'm the one running. But I'm asking. Reon stepped back. He did it slowly, every inch of it visibly costing him, a man putting his own want back in a box by hand. He scrubbed his face. And then, instead of being angry, which Soobin could have armored against, he was gentle, which Soobin could not armor against at all. He smiled. Small, rueful, real. You know what's strange, Reon said. I've known you 3 years, and I would have told anyone that I had you figured out. Sharp. Contained. Good in a meeting, hard to read, keeps everyone at the same polite distance. That's who I thought you were. He shook his head slowly, looking at Soobin like he was a puzzle that had just changed shape in his hands. And then, this last week or two, it's like a different person came out from behind the one I knew. Warmer, funnier. You say things now that the old you would never have said. You looked at me in the car that night like you actually saw me instead of just clocking me as a colleague. I keep thinking I imagined it, that I'm inventing a person because I want one. But I'm not inventing it. You changed, or you stopped hiding, and whichever it is, his voice dropped. I like him. Whoever this is that you've started letting me see. I like him more than I have ever liked anyone, and the strange part is I never felt that way about you before these last couple of weeks. You were just a man I worked beside, and now I cannot think straight when you are in the room. And Soobin stood against the door of that restroom and could not speak, because the man had just told him, without knowing it, the entire truth. He had noticed. Some deep part of Reon had noticed that the person from this week was not the person from the 3 years before. He had felt the seam. He just could not see what the seam was, because the explanation that these were 2 different people was the one explanation a sane man would never reach for. So he had filed it. Under you changed, you stopped hiding, and he had fallen for the change, which was to say he had fallen for Soobin, the real one, and had thanked the wrong man for it. I have to go, Soobin whispered, and this time Reon let him, stepping aside, and Soobin slipped out of the restroom and down the quiet hall with the scarf askew and the taste of the alpha still on his mouth, and the bond howling at the growing distance, and he did not stop walking until he was out of the building and across the street and around a corner, where he leaned against a cold wall and pressed both hands over his face and tried to remember how a person was supposed to live inside a situation that had no honest move left in it. He did not go back to the firm for the rest of that afternoon. He walked instead, a long, aimless loop through the cold along the river until the bond had quieted from a howl to its low, constant note, and when he finally went back to the borrowed apartment that night, he found he could not be in it. The rooms were full of Reon now, the couch where it had started, the kitchen where the man had leaned against the counter and said he did not want to be a good colleague. Soobin stood in the middle of it with the scarf in his hand and understood that there was no room left in his life that did not have the alpha in it somewhere, and that he had done that, and that he would do it again. Reon called near midnight. Soobin should not have answered. He answered on the first ring. The man's voice came through low and careful. None of the firm in it, none of the careful colleague, just the person from the car, and he said he was not calling to push, he was calling because he could feel the distance through the bond, and it was keeping him awake, and he wanted to know that Soobin was all right. That was all he could hang up right after, and Soobin sat on the floor with his back against the couch and his phone pressed to his ear, and they did not talk about the restroom, and they did not talk about the mark. They talked about nothing, the way they had in the car, and it went on for hours. Two voices in the dark across a city, and it was the most intimate thing that had happened between them yet. More than the kiss, more than the bite, because there was nothing physical in it at all, only the choice to stay on the line. The next day was the worst of the resisting, because the next day Reon stopped resisting, and Soobin had no idea how to defend against a careful man who had decided to be gentle. He did not crowd him. He did the opposite. He gave Soobin room all morning, easy and warm and patient, and the patience was harder to withstand than any pursuit could have been, because it asked nothing and offered everything. And by the end of the day, Soobin was the one who could not keep his eyes off the line of the man's shoulders, the one whose attention kept sliding sideways, the one undone by a person doing nothing but existing one desk away and occasionally looking up to find him already looking. It broke late when the floor had emptied. Reon came to stand by the window where Soobin had been pretending to read a brief, and he did not say anything. He just stood near, close enough that the scent reached him. Wet limestone and bitter orange and the warm spice under it, and the bond pulled tight between them, and Soobin felt the man's nearness in the mark on his throat like a hand laid over it. Neither of them spoke. Reon lifted his hand, slow, telegraphing every inch of it before he ever touched, giving Soobin all the time he wanted to step back, and he tucked a piece of hair back from Soobin's face, his fingers barely grazing the edge of the scarf, and the touch ran down through Soobin to the floor. The 2 cents in the room turned over into the third one, the rain coming down on warm stone, and Soobin breathed it in and did not step back, and for a long moment they stood at the window in the gold and the quiet, not kissing, not speaking, just close. And it was worse than kissing. It was the thing kissing was only a smaller version of. 2 people choosing the same square foot of air and refusing to leave it. I am not going to ask you for anything, Reon said finally, very low. I told you I could be patient, and I meant it. But I need you to know I am not going anywhere, whatever this is, whatever you are so afraid to tell me. I have spent my whole life being the man who keeps the door shut, and you got it open, and I am not interested in closing it again. So take your time. I will be here when you are ready. He said it like a vow, simply, the way a steady man says the thing he has decided, and then he stepped back and gave Soobin the room he had promised, and walked out and left Soobin standing at the window with the borrowed brief and the singing throat and the unbearable knowledge that the man had just promised to stay through a truth he could not imagine. And the vow was the thing that stayed with him, after the man had gone. Not the guilt, which he had carried for 2 weeks without it changing anything. Not the fear of being caught, which had only ever made him hide better. It was a man saying, "I am not going anywhere," to a person who did not exist, offering his loyalty to a name, and Soobin standing at that window, understanding, for the first time with his whole chest, that loyalty given to the wrong name was a kind of theft, and that he could not keep spending the man's heart on it. Something in him began to turn that night, slow and final, toward the only move he had left and had been refusing for 2 weeks. He did not know yet exactly when he would make it. He only knew, walking home under the cold lights, that the refusing was over. Across the river, in the same borrowed second week, his brother was caught in a gentler version of the same trap and handling it with considerably more grace. Taeryn was still at the design studio, still answering to Soobin's name, still sitting at Soobin's desk by the window, because the extra week ran both directions and neither twin had said the real reason out loud, and the real reason, on Taeryn's side, sat at the next table over with his sleeves pushed up and brought coffee from the corner place without being asked. Reon, the quiet alpha who had spent the first week noticing the seam in a man he thought he already knew, who had said, "You seem different, sharper," and then filed it away without pushing. He had kept noticing through the second week. Taeryn could feel it. The slow, patient attention, the sense of being read by someone who was in no hurry to announce his conclusions. Reon had a way of being near that asked for nothing. And Taeryn, who had spent a decade keeping people at a measured distance, found that he did not deploy the distance against him, which was its own quiet alarm. The man did not crowd him. He did not fill the air. He worked at the next table with the particular focus of someone who liked the work, and every so often he would say a thing, dry and exact, that made Taeryn put his pen down to keep from smiling, and then he would go back to it, unhurried, as if he had not just become the most interesting thing in the room. The coffee runs continued, the 3 o'clock walk to the corner place that Reon framed as a survival measure, and Taeryn had stopped pretending was about coffee. They were the cleanest part of his day. Reon walked slow and talked little, and somehow Taeryn told him things on those walks that he had not told anyone in years, about the case that was eating him alive across the river, dressed in studio clothes so the cover held, about the brother he had let drift, about the particular exhaustion of being good at a life you are not sure you chose. Reon listened completely, gave it his full attention, and never once tried to fix it. And that turned out to be the thing Taeryn had been starving for without a name. Someone who heard him and did not immediately reach for a solution as though he were a problem to be closed. One afternoon, the studio's lead pulled up Soobin's old files in a review. The bright, funny early ones, and the room admired them. And afterward, Reon lingered at Taeryn's table and said, low, that those early ones had a person in them, and the recent work had been hiding, and that whoever had been at this desk these last 2 weeks had stopped hiding, and he liked watching it. He did not know he was telling the truth twice over. Taeryn held very still under it, because the man had just described the swap without knowing the swap existed, had looked at 2 different people's work, and felt the seam between them, and called the newer one less hidden. And Taeryn understood, sitting there, that Reon was reading him more accurately than people who had known him for years, and that this should have frightened him, and instead made his pulse do something inconvenient. They started staying late. It was never arranged. The studio would empty, and the 2 of them would still be there. Taeryn pretending to work a file he could not have built to save his life. Reon doing the real thing, and the quiet between them would change temperature without either of them touching it. Taeryn was aware of him the way you are aware of a fire in a cold room, the pull of warmth you keep telling yourself you are only sitting near for practical reasons. Once their hands met, reaching for the same marker, and neither pulled back fast, and the green river water scent of the man reached him across the small distance. Cold grass and something underneath, like a garden after the sun has gone. And Taeryn, who governed himself for a living, felt the governing slip and had to look back down at the meaningless file to find it again. He thought about it on the train. He thought about it more than the case, which had never once happened in 3 years of the case. He told himself it was the swap. The unreality of the borrowed weeks, the way stepping out of his own life had loosened something in him that would tighten right back the moment he stepped into it again. He did not quite believe himself. What he felt when Jaewon set a coffee down without being asked wasn't the loosening of a borrowed life. It was the specific gravity of one person turning, slowly, toward another, and Taeryn had felt it rarely enough to know it when it came, and to be afraid of it. Because it was real, and it was his, and it belonged to a man who still believed he was someone else. And that was the splinter under all of it, the thing that kept him from simply letting the warmth happen the way his brother across the river was letting it happen. Jaewon was being drawn to a name that was not his. Every good moment between them was built on the cover, and the better the moments got, the less Taeryn could stand that they were built on anything but the truth. He was not made the way Soobin was made. He could not run the warm thing now and leave the cold reckoning for later. The lie sat in him like a stone he could feel with every breath, and somewhere in the back half of that second week he began, quietly, to want to set it down. Not because he was caught, but because he could not keep being wanted under false colors by the first person in years who had actually seen him. It came to a head late one evening when the studio had emptied out and it was only the two of them left. Taeryn pretending to review a design file he did not understand, and Jaewon at the next table doing actual work. And the quiet between them had gone from comfortable to charged without either of them moving. Jaewon spoke without looking up from his work. "You go quiet before you answer." Taeryn's pen stopped. "What?" "Soobin doesn't do that." Now Jaewon looked up, unhurried, and there was nothing accusing in his face, only a quiet warmth. A man saying a thing he had turned over for a while before deciding to say it at all. He fills the silence. Makes the joke. You let it sit. Like you'd rather get it right than get it said. A pause. "You're not him." The words landed soft in the empty room, not an accusation, just a thing finally set down, and Taeryn went very still, and the file blurred in front of him, and he did not answer, which was its own kind of answer. Jaewon set his pen down. He did not push. He waited, the way he always waited, and when he spoke again, it was quieter still. "I noticed the first day. Told myself I was imagining it. Then I kept noticing, and I stopped being able to call it nothing, because I started looking forward to it." His mouth tilted, almost shy. The going quiet. The sharp word instead of the easy one. "Whoever's been at that desk for 2 weeks, I liked him. I'd like to know his name." And Taeryn, who had spent his whole life being the one who held the truth at arm's length so other people would not have to, looked at the man who had seen straight through 2 weeks of practiced performance and found that he did not want to lie to him for one more minute. "I'm his twin," he said quietly. "Taeryn. We swapped lives. It started as a joke, and it stopped being one somewhere in the first week, and the person you've been bringing coffee to is me. Not him. I should have told you days ago. I think I didn't, because the second I told you, you'd know the whole thing was built on a lie, and I didn't want to watch you look at me differently. Which is," he exhaled, "which is a cowardly reason and not one I'm proud of, and you deserved the truth a lot sooner than this." Jaewon was quiet for a moment. Then, instead of the hurt or the suspicion Taeryn had braced for, his face eased, almost like relief. "I won't," Jaewon said. "Look at you differently. I spent 2 weeks drawn to someone I thought I already knew, and it turns out I'd never met him. That's not a betrayal. That's the first thing that's made sense since you sat down." He held Taeryn's eyes. "Taeryn, a lawyer, judging by how you stand like you're about to cross-examine the coffee machine. By how I stand. Across the river. Across the river." Taeryn's mouth tugged despite himself. "Which makes this inconvenient. The swap ends in a few days. Then I'm a man you've never officially met." "So meet me properly," Jaewon said, and stood. and came around the work table, unhurried, and stopped a deliberate and entirely polite distance away, close enough that the scent reached Taeryn, cut grass and cold river water and that faint green note underneath like a garden after dark, close enough that Taeryn forgot the file entirely. When the week's up, coffee from the real place. Both our actual names. We find out if it holds up under the right one. A pause. I think it will. Taeryn looked at him, at this man who had caught the seam when no one else had, and met the truth with relief instead of suspicion, and felt something he had been holding very tightly for a very long time begin, at last, to loosen. Yes, Taeryn said simply, the way his brother could not manage to say it to anyone. I'd like that. And in an emptied-out studio, late, with both their real names finally on the table, something quiet and clean and entirely honest began. The version of the thing his brother was drowning in across the river. Two halves of the same disaster going in opposite directions. One built on a truth told the moment it was asked for, and one buried under a lie that was running out of room. Near the end of that second week, the brothers broke their own rule again and met in person, because Soobin could not carry what he was carrying alone for one more night, and the only person on earth who could possibly understand the shape of it had the same face. He did. They picked a different place this time. A late diner near the river where the two of them could sit in a back booth and be, for an hour, neither of the men they were pretending to be. Taeryn slid in across from him, and the first thing he did was look at the scarf, still wound twice around his brother's throat, indoors, again, and his eyes narrowed a fraction, the lawyer flicker, and Soobin watched him decide not to ask, and felt the cowardly relief of it curdle in his stomach. They ordered. They talked around the edges. And then Taeryn set down his cup and said, quiet, that Soobin looked like a man who had not slept properly in a week, and asked him in the particular voice he used only with his twin, what was actually going on. Soobin almost told him. The whole thing rose up in him, the bite, the bond, the mark under the wool, the name Reon kept saying that was the wrong name, and he got as far as opening his mouth before the size of it stopped him. He could not say I am bonded to your colleague across a diner table. He could not watch his brother's face do what his brother's face would do. So he gave him a smaller truth instead, which was its own kind of cowardice dressed as honesty. He said there was someone. He said it was bad, that he had fallen into something he had no right to, that the someone did not know the truth about him, and that every day the not knowing got worse. He did not say the someone was Reon. He let Taeryn believe it was a complication of the swap in the abstract, a studio entanglement, a mess that would resolve when the weeks ended. And Taeryn, hearing only half of it, gave him the other half of himself anyway. He said he understood more than Soobin knew. He said carefully, turning his cup, that he had had his own version of the same trouble across the river, a person who had started as nothing and become, somewhere in 2 borrowed weeks, the thing he looked forward to, and that he had already told him the truth. All of it. The swap and the name and the lie, because he could not stand to be wanted under a false name by someone who had bothered to actually see him. He said it plainly, the same as he said everything once he had worked it out, and Soobin sat there and felt the difference between them land like a slap, because his brother had looked at the exact same impossible situation and arrived without apparent effort at the honest move. The brave one. The one Soobin had been avoiding for 2 weeks with a scarf and a schedule. You make it sound easy, Soobin said, and there was an edge in it he had not meant to let out. The old edge. The one that came up when his steadier brother made a hard thing look like simple arithmetic. Taeryn looked at him for a moment. It is not easy, he said. It is the opposite of easy. But the alternative is letting someone fall for a person who does not exist. And I have watched you do a gentler version of that your whole life. Hand people the bright 30 seconds and keep the rest locked up. And I am telling you as the person who loves you most that it does not work. That the locked up part does not stay locked. That one day it gets out and the only question is whether you chose the moment or it chose you. It was, Soobin would think later, the truest and least welcome thing anyone had said to him in years, and it was true precisely because Taeryn did not know how true it was, did not know that the locked-up part had already gotten out, had gotten out onto a couch and a restroom door, had a name now and teeth marks and a bond humming under a gray scarf. Soobin looked at his brother across the table, this man who shared his face and had somehow ended up braver in all the ways that counted, and he felt two things at once that he could not separate: love and a thin, cold thread of resentment, because Taeryn had walked into the easy life and made it sharp, and walked into an honest romance and was going to tell the truth and land on his feet, and Soobin had walked into the serious life and fallen into the deepest hole of his life and could not find the bottom of it. They paid. On the cold sidewalk, Taeryn pulled him into a hug, the way he had at the start of all this, and held on longer than he needed to, and said into his shoulder that whatever it was, whatever Soobin had gotten into, he would help him out of it. That there was no version of any of this where Soobin was alone in it, that they had wasted years being strangers, and he was not going to let his brother face a hard thing by himself ever again. And Soobin held on and could not answer, because the help his brother was promising was help he could not accept without saying the one thing he still could not say, and because the hard thing he was facing alone was in part a hard thing he had done to his brother, and the not telling had stopped being only about Reon. It was about Terran now too. It had become, somewhere in these 2 weeks, the largest lie he had ever told the person he had never once lied to, because the lie was running out of room. That was the thing Soobin understood that week, with the bond aching across the city every hour he and Reon were apart, and the memory of the restroom replaying every time he closed his eyes. He could not keep this up. He could not keep being a man named Terran by text and a stranger in person and a coward in the mirror. The kinder Reon was, the more impossible the telling became, because there is nothing harder to break than something that is being gentle with you. He made the decision on the last gray evening of the second week, the night before the swap was finally, truly going to end, when there would be no more borrowed name to hide behind and no more reprieve to buy. He decided he was going to tell Reon the truth. All of it. The swap, the brother, the name, the week. He was going to do it properly this time, not in a restroom and not by text, but somewhere quiet where the man could hear it and have room to react, and then whatever happened would at least be happening to the real him. He texted Reon, "Come by the apartment tonight, after work. There's something I have to tell you, and I should have told you a long time ago, and I can't do it anywhere but somewhere private. Please come." Reon texted back almost at once, "Of course, whatever it is, I'll be there." It would be Taeryn's apartment, because that was where Soobin still lived, for one more night as Taeryn. It was the only home Reon knew for the man he had been driving back here all week, the building where Soobin had said, "This is me," on the night of the bite. The swap did not end until tomorrow, which meant tonight the apartment was still Soobin's to use, the borrowed life still draped over him for a few more hours, and there was a bitter symmetry in choosing to tell the truth. In the last place he would ever stand inside the lie. He spent the rest of that day there in a strange calm, the calm of a person who has finally stopped running and turned to face the thing chasing him. He tidied the rooms he had lived in for 2 borrowed weeks. He took the scarf off and studied the mark in the mirror, the crescent that had become, somewhere in the last weeks, the truest thing about him. He rehearsed the truth until it stopped sounding like the end of the world and started sounding like the start of something he could not see yet. He was ready. For the first time, he was actually ready. Reon arrived a little after dark, still in his work clothes, his coat over his arm, and there was something open and hopeful in his face that nearly broke Soobin's resolve, because the man thought he had been summoned towards something good, and in a way, he had. The truth was a good thing. The truth was the only good thing left. It just did not feel like one yet. "Hi," Reon said, stepping inside, and the door closed behind him. and the bond hummed at the nearness. Glad, simple, animal. You said you had something to tell me. I've been thinking about it all day. Whatever it is, he set his coat down. I want you to know that I'm not going anywhere. Whatever you've been so scared of, I can take it. I've decided. So, tell me, I'm listening. Soobin took a breath. He faced the man he had deceived and bonded and fallen for, standing in the living room saying, I'm not going anywhere. And he opened his mouth, and he reached for the truth he had been carrying for weeks, and he was finally going to say it. And the front door opened. Soobin had forgotten one thing. One small, ordinary thing buried under the avalanche of everything else. It was Taeryn's apartment. Soobin had been living in it through both weeks of the swap, but it was Taeryn's name on the lease and Taeryn's key in Taeryn's pocket, and the two of them had agreed, days ago, before any of this had spun so far out of his hands, that on the final night of the swap they would meet here, the place where it all began, and properly debrief the whole experiment over takeout. Tonight was that night. And Terran, prompt as ever, brisk and bright and carrying a paper bag of food, let himself in through the door of his own apartment with his own key. He stopped 2 steps inside. He looked at his brother. He looked at the alpha standing in the middle of the living room. He looked at the alpha he knew, his colleague, the careful man he had gotten coffee with for 3 years, standing in his brother's apartment with his coat off, and his whole face fell open with confusion. Soobin, Taeryn said. What? He looked between them, the paper bag going slack in his hand. Reon, what are you doing in... And then, turning to his brother, baffled, with no idea yet what he had just walked into the middle of, Soobin, what is going on? Why is he... Reon's face changed. He looked at the man who had just walked in, the one with the same face as the person he had bonded, the one this stranger had just called Soobin. Then he looked back at the man he had spent weeks calling Terran. Soobin watched him do the math and arrive, slowly, at the part that did not add up. Soobin, Reon said slowly, tasting the unfamiliar word, looking at the man he had kissed against a door. Then he turned to the brother in the doorway, the identical stranger, and the question came out of him quiet and careful. Who's Soobin? Why did you just call him Soobin? His eyes went back and forth between the 2 identical faces. Once, twice, and his voice, when it came again, had something in it that had not been there before, the first cold edge of a man realizing the ground he is standing on is not ground at all. Which one of you is Terran? And neither twin had a single word ready to answer him. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this part, tell me your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. The final part is coming soon.